If we die with him, we'll live with him. If we stick it out with him, we'll rule with him. If we turn our backs on him, he'll turn his backs on us. If we give up on him, he does not give up. For there is no way he can be false to himself.
Before spell check or the other writing tools that are available to us in this computer age, I had a nifty little rhyme that I would use to keep my I's and E's in the right order. Some of you might know it. What is it? It's the I before E rule. And it goes something like this. I before E, except after C, except when sounding like A, as in neighbor and way. Now, unfortunately, this trustworthy saying didn't help me when I started dating a girl with the last name Weir. Now, years later, when we got married, she took my last name, and it took care of my spelling difficulties. But I still had difficulty with my I's and my E's. A friend later suggested to me that the rule actually does work, except when your foreign neighbor Keith receives 8 counterfeit beige sleighs from a feisty, caffeinated weightlifter. Now, if you actually look into it, you'll find that there are at least 925 exceptions to the I before E rule, and in fact, it only accurately describes the spelling of 44 proper English words. Now, fortunately, the Apostle Paul had a better idea of what constituted a trustworthy saying. There are 5 places in the New Testament where he uses this phrase. One of them is the text that Sadie read for us this week, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 13. The 5 places are found, 3 of them in 1 Timothy 1 12 to 17, 3 1 to 7, 4 8 to 10, and then finally Titus chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. Now, in each of these places, Paul seems to just suddenly stop through his discourse to quote some lyrical, rhythmic prose, which some scholars suggest might have actually been early church hymns that were sung by the church. This is particularly true of the text here in 2 Timothy. If you even look at it in the Greek, the Greek translators recognize it as being poetic as well. It even sounds poetic if you read it in the Greek. Agar suna pethanomen kai suzesomen. Ihupa menomen kai sumbasalesomen. And so on and so on. It just kind of has this nice back and forth rhythm. It's quite lyrical and quite rhythmic. Now, here in chapter 2, Paul is encouraging Timothy in this second letter, and he begins by encouraging him to stay strong in the grace found in Jesus Christ in verse 1, to endure hardship in verse 3, and to remember Jesus Christ raised from the dead in verse 8. And then suddenly, Paul interjects this poetic verse that Sadie read for us this morning. It's recognized by translators as being distinct with the surrounding text. Now, whether Paul is the actual author of this poetic verse, or whether he was inspired to quote from a familiar early Christian hymn, the point is, the encouragement found here fits perfectly within the present context. The 4 lines of poetry in verses 11 to 13 work as 2 pairs of doublets. The first 2 are positive, while the second 2 at least appear negative. Paul's use of verb tense also kind of dials up the intensity here as he punctuates a contrast that's being drawn. If you look in verse 11, Paul writes, "If we die with him," in the aorist tense, "we will live with him," in the future tense. Now, in Greek, the aorist verb tense is used for background action, things that are kind of going on in the background and are assumed to be complete. Now, Paul's not writing to dead people here. He's not saying people who have actually died, but rather he's writing to people who have previously been buried in the waters of baptism. Paul's point here is found in Romans chapter 6, one of my favorite verses on the topic of baptism. In Romans chapter 6, he says, "What then shall we say? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who have died to sin go on living in it? Do you not know that all of us who've been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we've been united with him in death like this, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. Paul's point here is that those who've previously died to sin, those who have been buried in the water, therefore, they can anticipate a life to come, a life in the future. In the second line, in verse 12, Paul writes, if we endure, present tense, we will reign with him, future tense. Here, the present tense is used to bring the action forward. In Greek, the present tense was used not just for action happening now, but it's action that's much more present, and it's also action that's potentially incomplete at this time. We're not done enduring, Paul would say. It's not something that's complete and in the background. We continue to endure, but the promise remains firm. As Paul wrote in Romans 8:17, if we're children of God, then we are heirs and heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. We share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. Our present suffering, then, is incomplete, but the assurance that we have been given is certain and full. Then our poem takes an awkward turn, stating the obvious in bold detail. If we will deny him, future tense, then he will deny us, future tense. This time, Paul uses the future tense in both actions, and both actions are reciprocal. Our denial affects us both as his denial affects our own. But this is not a punishment. God's not petulantly rejecting us because we've rejected him. Rather, Paul makes it clear here that God doesn't force anybody into a covenantal relationship, that God's invitation is open, but he has made his way clear, and our agency remains intact, that we are graciously invited into this new life, but we're not forced into it. Now finally, in verse 13, our poem continues in the negative, but there's a surprising turn here. If we are faithless, present tense, he remains faithful, present tense. For the first time in this little sing-song section of the text, God's action, the second part of the doublet, is brought out of the future tense into the present. Our denial was reciprocated in verse 12, but God's faithfulness is constant and is ongoing. As Paul adds at the end of verse 13, the reason for this is that he can't deny himself. So there's this beautiful picture that even if we are faithless, God isn't faithless. Even if we are faithless, God is faithful, because he can't even deny himself. This last part, though, can be easily misunderstood. Taken from its context, this last section here can fit on a coffee cup, or it can fit in a Facebook post, and the startling theology behind the statement is lost. To quote, even if we are faithless, he will still be faithful, it misses the point. The point is, does verse 13 read as a threat or a promise? Paul has spanned the two extremes in this little song. He's gone from past tense death through present tense endurance to future apostasy. But then in verse 13, he pulls back to the present tense, and he talks about present day faithfulness. Paul says that despite our present unfaithfulness, he remains faithful. But faithful to what? Well, an interpretive key is found again in the verb tenses here. The word remains here is a present tense verb. In verse 13, it matches with the endurance that's in the verse previous. God remains faithful to himself and to his own nature. Now, our endurance might fail and our conviction might falter, but God reminds us that in all things, God acts true to God's own nature. That in dying so that we could live, And enduring so that we might reign, Jesus Christ is faithful to God's nature, to his own nature. And our faith rests in the faithfulness of God, and not in our own godliness, and not in our own competence. Jesus is the reflection of God's perfect love and his perfect faithfulness. Here, Paul is encouraging Timothy that even if we are lacking in our own conviction, Jesus Christ remains true to his perfect nature. This is not an invitation to a wishy-washy gospel, however, but rather, this is an encouragement that we can trust. We are not saved by our own faithfulness, but by his. As a result, we can truly live because he died. We one day will reign with him because he endured. The gospel looks like God's faithfulness. And that looks like something in our life, especially during a pandemic. Our work life right now might be tremendously uncertain and chaotic. Our world might be turned upside down right now. But God is faithful. God is true. God is trustworthy. And so we can put our hope in him and in his faithfulness. This present suffering that we are in the midst of is for our sanctification and for our glory, or for his glory rather, even though it's no fun to go through right now. It's doing something. It is accomplishing something for God's purposes. And if God is true and God is faithful and God is loving, if God is all those things, then when God accomplishes what God sets out to do, it's a good thing, even when it's hard for us. The best gospel proclamation that you can make in your workplace right now to your coworkers, it might not be a witty retelling of a series of Bible texts strung out through the book of Romans that somehow spells out the process of salvation, but rather the best presentation of the gospel that you could make right now might be just sharing how you are trusting God's faithfulness through this uncertain work environment. That God has been faithful in the past, and as a result, God will continue to be faithful in the present. That's sharing your faith. That's sharing the gospel. The 5 steps of salvation, no matter how true they are not going to have traction with people at your work right now the way you're getting through the pandemic does without losing your mind. Now, this might be a very convincing thing to share with people at your work, is that the faithfulness of God can be trusted and that you're seeing evidence of how God is using this pandemic for good, even though it's not a good thing. So I pray that we could have the conviction to live in light of the hope that we have, that God is faithful and therefore he will be faithful.